Captain Rebecca Hayes had walked into hostile territory before combat zones, where enemy fire could end your life in seconds. But stepping into the sterile flight bay at Redstone Advanced Flight Integration felt different. This wasn't about dodging bullets. This was about proving she belonged in a place where everyone had already decided she didn't. The morning air was crisp as she made her way across the tarmac, her regulation flight suit pressed to military perfection. Her mission data sheet was tucked securely under her arm, and her combat boots clicked against the concrete with the confidence that came from over 1,200 hours of documented flight time. 350 of those hours had been logged inactive. Combat zones, places where mechanical failure or pilot error meant death, not just a failed training exercise. Rebecca was the only woman in the current training cohort. She was also the only pilot under 35. And apparently, according to what she'd overheard in the mess hall yesterday, she was the only one worth making jokes about before she'd even introduced herself. The flight bay doors loomed ahead, and through the glass, she could see a cluster of male pilots gathered near the briefing area. Their conversation died the moment she approached. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped inside. Colonel Marcus Kane didn't offer the customary handshake or professional greeting that military protocol typically required. Instead, he looked her up and down with obvious condescension, his weathered face twisted into what could generously be called a smile. Then he deliberately turned toward the other pilots, ensuring his voice carried across the entire bay. "Well, this should be entertaining," he announced with theatrical volume. "I just hope she understands that the cockpit isn't designed to be a selfie booth for social media content." Cruel laughter rippled through the assembled group behind her, the kind of calculated mockery specifically designed to isolate and intimidate rather than foster any sense of professional respect. Rebecca felt her jaw tighten, but she didn't flinch. She'd heard worse in combat briefings from men who later depended on her to save their lives. She didn't offer a defensive response, didn't attempt to justify her presence, didn't waste energy on verbal sparring with someone who had already decided her worth before observing her capabilities. Instead, she walked directly to the flight simulator chair, methodically placed her pre-flight checklist on the instrument panel, and began conducting standard diagnostic procedures with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that performance speaks louder than arguments. Colonel Kane shook his head with exaggerated disappointment and began walking away, clearly satisfied with his public humiliation of the new arrival. "You'll be conducting simulation testing on Maneuver 6B at 50% telemetry feedback," he announced over his shoulder without bothering to turn around. "If you somehow manage to make it past the initial navigation loop sequence, you'll already be performing better than 3 lieutenants from last training cycle." What Colonel Kane conveniently failed to mention to the assembled group was that he himself had attempted that exact same simulation exercise 3 months earlier during his own proficiency evaluation. He had failed it twice. The first failure had been witnessed by his immediate superior and documented in his permanent training record. The second failure had occurred during a remedial training session specifically designed to help him overcome the deficiencies that had caused his initial poor performance. Both failures remained classified information, known only to senior command staff and the simulation technicians who had been present during his unsuccessful attempts. Rebecca began her pre-flight procedures, unaware of the irony that she was about to attempt a maneuver that had defeated the same officer who was publicly questioning her competence. She ran through her mental checklist, the same one that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments and dozens of emergency landings under enemy fire. The other pilots had settled into the observation area, some leaning against the reinforced glass partition with arms crossed, others checking their phones with feigned disinterest. But Rebecca caught the subtle glances, the way conversations died when she moved, the careful positioning that kept them close enough to watch but far enough. A way to maintain plausible deniability if questioned about their obvious anticipation of her failure. As she secured herself in the simulator harness, Rebecca's hands moved with the mechanical precision that spoke of extensive, real-world experience under genuine life-or-death conditions. The familiar weight of the flight helmet settled over her head, and for a moment, she allowed herself to remember the last time she'd worn it in actual combat guiding a damaged helicopter full of wounded soldiers through a sandstorm while taking enemy fire. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents are those who project their own failures onto others, while forgetting that skill doesn't discriminate based on gender, age, or preconceived notions about who belongs in the cockpit of an advanced military aircraft. The simulation was about to begin, and Rebecca was ready to remind everyone in that room exactly what a real pilot could do. The blackout navigation rollover recovery exercise had a 71% failure rate. Even experienced pilots with thousands of flight hours frequently chose to abort the exercise early rather than risk complete system failure that would result in automatic disqualification from the advanced training program. Rebecca had heard whispers about Maneuver 6B during her first week at Redstone. It was the kind of simulation that ended careers and shattered confidence. A catastrophic failure scenario designed to simulate the simultaneous loss of GPS navigation systems and inertial measurement unit guidance during active flight operations, with a critically narrow response window of exactly 17 seconds to prevent total aircraft loss. Colonel Kane positioned himself behind the reinforced observation glass in the control room, arms crossed with obvious anticipation of witnessing another failure. The other pilots had gathered closer now, their earlier disinterest replaced by genuine curiosity. Word had spread through the facility that the new arrival was about to attempt the exercise that had humbled some of their most experienced colleagues. "Just try not to cry when you hit the simulated ground," Kane called out through the intercom system, his voice dripping with calculated cruelty. "We're completely out of tissues, and I'm not sending anyone to get more." Rebecca methodically secured herself in the simulator harness and conducted her standard pre-flight system checks. Her hands moved across the control panel with practiced efficiency, each switch and dial verified according to the protocols that had been drilled into her through years of training and combat experience. She waited for the exercise to begin, her breathing steady and controlled. The moment the flight controls activated and the simulation scenario went live, her hands moved with mechanical precision that spoke of extensive real-world experience under genuine life-or-death conditions. The cockpit displays flickered to simulate the catastrophic system failure. Warning lights flashed red across the instrument panel, and automated voice alerts began announcing multiple system failures in rapid succession. Control switches were flipped in perfect sequence. Navigation vectors were manually adjusted with split-second timing. Aircraft attitude was rolled 90 degrees in a controlled descent before the warning systems could even register the emergency status. She caught the simulated stall before it could develop into an unrecoverable spin, compensated for programmed wind drift using manual calculations rather than automated systems, and successfully rerouted primary power to backup flight. Control systems. All accomplished in under 16 seconds. 1 full second remaining before the exercise would have automatically terminated in failure. The simulation completion buzzer sounded, indicating successful mission completion. She had executed what the program classified as nearly impossible. Maneuver 1 that had defeated seasoned pilots with decades of experience. Inside the control room, the simulation technician stared at his instrumentation readings with obvious disbelief before turning toward Colonel Kane. "Sir, she completed the full sequence successfully. Perfect execution. No penalties assessed. No system violations recorded." The silence that followed was deafening. Through the observation glass, Rebecca could see Kane standing motionless, his expression frozen somewhere between shock and humiliation. She calmly unstrapped herself from the simulator harness, stood up with professional composure, and exited the cockpit without making any verbal comment about her performance or seeking recognition for what she had accomplished. But every other pilot in the facility stared at her with the kind of respect that comes from witnessing someone achieve what they themselves knew was beyond their own capabilities. The dynamics of the entire training program had shifted in 17 seconds, and everyone present understood that they were dealing with a pilot whose skills exceeded their initial assumptions by a considerable margin. One of the senior flight instructors stepped closer to Kane and whispered discreetly, "Wasn't that the same exercise you couldn't complete during your proficiency evaluation last quarter?" Without responding to the question or acknowledging the achievement he had just witnessed, Colonel Kane turned and walked directly out of the control room, leaving behind an atmosphere of stunned silence and the unmistakable understanding that everything had changed. The aftermath of Rebecca's flawless execution of Maneuver 6B created a strange atmosphere at Redstone. The crew jokes stopped abruptly, replaced by something almost worse: complete isolation. For the next week, she might as well have been invisible. During morning briefings, Colonel Kane would assign mission parameters to every pilot except her, leaving her sitting at the polished conference table while others received their training schedules. When she raised her hand to inquire about her assignments, he would glance at his watch and announce that the session was running long, dismissing everyone before addressing her questions. The other pilots had formed an informal conspiracy of silence around her. Conversations would die the moment she approached. Tables would mysteriously fill up before she could sit down in the mess hall. Training equipment would suddenly be reserved or undergoing maintenance whenever she needed access. But Rebecca wasn't entirely alone. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a quiet pilot from Ohio with over 8 years of service, had been watching the deliberate ostracism with growing discomfort. During her second week of isolation, he approached her after a particularly uncomfortable briefing session where Kane had handed out training schedules to everyone except her. "This isn't right," Jake said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "What Kane's doing, it's not professional and it's not legal. You outperformed everyone on that simulation, and now he's retaliating because you made him look bad." Rebecca appreciated the support, but she'd dealt with hostile commanding officers before. "I can handle Kane," she replied, organizing her unused mission materials. "I've dealt with worse in combat zones." "That's not the point," Jake pressed. "There are regulations about this kind of treatment. Equal access to training opportunities, fair assignment of exercises, professional conduct standards. Kane's violating at least 3 different military protocols, and if someone documented it..." He trailed off, but Rebecca understood the implication. Jake was offering to be a witness to help her build a formal complaint. It was a risky move for him. Speaking out against a commanding officer could damage his own career prospects. "I appreciate the offer," Rebecca said, "but I need to see how far he's willing to push this first." Sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponent overplay their hand. Jake nodded reluctantly, but his expression suggested he thought she was making a mistake. As he walked away, Rebecca caught sight of Colonel Kane watching them from across the corridor, his face dark with suspicion and anger. That afternoon, Rebecca discovered that her security clearance for accessing advanced training materials had been temporarily suspended pending routine review. The suspension notice was dated 3 days earlier, but somehow the paperwork had only just reached her. When she inquired about the review timeline, the administrative staff claimed they had no information about when it might be resolved. The pattern was becoming clear. Kane couldn't challenge her flying abilities directly. Her performance had been too impressive, too public, and too well documented. Instead, he was using his administrative authority to systematically block her access to training opportunities, creating a paper trail that would make it appear she was falling behind, due to her own inadequacies rather than deliberate sabotage. By the end of the week, Rebecca had been excluded from 3 major training exercises, denied access to 2 crucial technical briefings, and removed from the rotation for hands-on aircraft maintenance training, all due to various administrative issues that seemed to resolve themselves immediately after the training opportunities had passed. Jake approached her again on Friday afternoon, his expression grim. "It's getting worse," he said. "Kane's been talking to the other instructors, suggesting that your simulation performance was a fluke. He's telling them you're not integrating well with the team, that you're having trouble keeping up with the program requirements." Rebecca felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same one she'd experienced during her early days in combat zones, when she'd realized that the enemy wasn't just the people shooting at her, but sometimes the people supposed to be on her side. "How far do you think he'll take this?" she asked. Jake's expression was grave. "As far as he needs to. Kane's career depends on maintaining his reputation as a top instructor. Having a pilot publicly outperform him on an exercise he failed? That's the kind of humiliation that follows you forever in military aviation. He can't let that stand." As if summoned by their conversation, Colonel Kane appeared at the end of the corridor, walking toward them with the deliberate stride of someone about to deliver bad news. "Captain Hayes," he called out, his voice carrying the false cheerfulness that always preceded his worst behavior. "I need to see you in my office. We have some performance issues to discuss." Colonel Kane's office was a shrine to his own ego walls covered with commendations, photographs of him with various military dignitaries, and aircraft models from every base where he'd served. Rebecca sat in the uncomfortable metal chair across from his desk, maintaining perfect military posture while he shuffled through a manila folder thick with paperwork. "I've been reviewing your performance metrics since arriving at Redstone," Kane began, his tone suggesting disappointment rather than the satisfaction she suspected he actually felt. "While your simulation results were adequate, there are concerning patterns in your overall integration with the program." He pulled out several documents, each one carefully prepared to paint a picture of her supposed deficiencies. Missed training sessions, the ones she'd been excluded from due to administrative issues. Incomplete certification requirements, the ones she couldn't complete because her security clearance had been suspended. Poor team integration scores, based on evaluations from pilots who have been instructed to ostracize her. Additionally, Kane continued, several instructors have expressed concerns about your attitude and responsiveness to feedback. Military aviation requires pilots who can work effectively within established command structures, not individuals who prioritize personal recognition over team cohesion. Rebecca felt her hands clench into fists in her lap. Every accusation was a deliberate distortion of the systematic exclusion she'd been experiencing. But Kane wasn't finished. "I'm recommending you for immediate transfer to a different program," he announced, sliding an official transfer request across the desk. "Something more suited to your particular skill set. The Transportation Division has an opening for cargo pilots. Less demanding, more appropriate for someone still developing their capabilities." The insult was perfectly crafted. Cargo pilots were essential to military operations, but reassignment from an elite combat training program to transportation duty would effectively end her career advancement. Everyone would understand the implication. She hadn't been capable of handling the demands of advanced flight training. "Sir," Rebecca said carefully, "I believe there may be some misunderstanding about my performance and participation." "Captain Hayes," Kane interrupted, his voice sharp with authority, "this decision isn't open for discussion. You have 48 hours to complete your transition paperwork and report to your new assignment. I suggest you use that time to reflect on the importance of fitting into military command structures rather than trying to stand out. He stood up, clearly indicating the meeting was over. Dismissed. Rebecca walked out of Kane's office feeling like she'd been sucker punched. In the corridor, she found Jake waiting for her, his expression immediately telling her he'd heard about what happened. "Transport division?" he asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak without revealing how shaken she felt. "Rebecca, you can't let him do this. What he's doing is retaliation, pure and simple. There are formal complaint procedures, inspector general reviews, congressional inquiries, if necessary. You don't have to just accept this." For the first time since arriving at Redstone, Rebecca felt truly defeated. Fighting back would mean months of bureaucratic battles, investigations that could drag on for years, and the constant stress of being labeled a troublemaker in a career field where reputation was everything. But as she walked back to her quarters that evening, passing the flight simulators where she'd proven her abilities and the briefing rooms where she'd been systematically excluded, something inside her began to shift. She thought about all the Serges, women who would come after her, the ones who would face the same treatment if someone didn't take a stand. She also thought about something Jake had mentioned earlier, the regulations Kane was violating. Military aviation had strict protocols about training equality, performance evaluation standards, and retaliation prevention. If Kane was breaking those rules, there would be documentation, evidence, witnesses. Most importantly, she remembered a conversation from her previous assignment. Her former commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Reynolds, had given her some advice before she'd left for Redstone. "Sometimes the system is broken, Rebecca. But sometimes the system just needs someone brave enough to use it properly." That night, Rebecca made 2 phone calls. The first was to Colonel Reynolds, who listened to the entire story with growing anger, and then provided some very specific guidance about military regulations and formal complaint procedures. The second call was to the Inspector General's office. At Pentagon level, a nuclear option that would launch a full investigation into Kane's conduct and Redstone's training practices. As she hung up the phone, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Kane thought he held all the cards, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed she would go quietly. Rebecca didn't sleep much that night. Instead, she methodically reviewed every interaction, every document, and every witness to Kane's systematic campaign against her. By morning, she had constructed a timeline that revealed a clear pattern of retaliation and discrimination. Colonel Reynolds had provided her with the specific military regulations Kane was violating, along with contact information for a military attorney who specialized in command misconduct cases. More importantly, she'd explained the proper channels for filing formal complaints that would trigger mandatory investigations. The first step was documenting everything with precision that would satisfy military legal standards. Rebecca spent the morning creating detailed written accounts of each incident, including dates, times, witnesses present, and exact quotes whenever possible. Her combat deployment experience had taught her the importance of thorough documentation. In war zones, sloppy records could get people killed. Jake found her in the base library that afternoon, surrounded by regulation manuals and legal documents. He sat down across from her, keeping his voice low. "Word's getting around that you're not taking the transfer quietly," he said. "Kane's been asking questions about who you've been talking to, what you've been doing with your time." "Let him ask," Rebecca replied, not looking up from the formal complaint she was drafting. "Everything I'm doing is completely within regulations. In fact, that's the point." She showed Jake the military handbook section covering training program administration, equal access to training opportunities, fair evaluation based on documented performance metrics, protection from retaliation for filing grievances. Keynes violated every single one of these standards. Jake scanned the documents, his expression growing more serious. This is more comprehensive than I expected. You're not just complaining about unfair treatment. You're building a case for systematic misconduct. Exactly. And Jake, I need to ask you something important. Would you be willing to provide a witness statement about what you've observed? I know it's risky for your career, but yes, he interrupted. Absolutely yes. What Keynes doing is wrong, and if someone doesn't stop him, he'll do it to the next woman who shows up here. And the one after that. That afternoon, Rebecca discovered she wasn't as alone as she thought. When word spread quietly that she was filing formal complaints, 3 other pilots approached her with their own stories about Keynes' behavior. Lieutenant David Park had been systematically excluded from advanced training opportunities after questioning one of Keynes' tactical decisions during a briefing. Captain Maria Rodriguez had been subjected to months of harassment after outperforming Keynes' favorite pilots during combat simulations. Most significantly, Sergeant Tom Bradley, one of the simulation technicians, approached her with information that changed everything. I've been working these systems for 12 years, Bradley said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. I've seen every simulation attempt, every failure, every success. Colonel Kane failed maneuver 6B 3 times, not twice. The 3rd attempt was during a remedial session that was supposed to be classified, but I have the complete technical readouts. He handed Rebecca a flash drive. Equipment diagnostic logs, performance metrics, even audio recordings of his verbal responses during the failed attempts. It's all there. Everything that proves he couldn't execute the maneuver you completed perfectly on your first try. Rebecca stared at the drive, understanding its implications. This wasn't just evidence of Keynes' professional limitations. It was proof that his treatment of her was motivated by personal humiliation rather than legitimate performance concerns. Why are you giving me this? She asked. Bradley's expression was grim, because I've watched him destroy good pilots for 3 years. People who had the skill and dedication to succeed in this program, but who couldn't survive his psychological warfare. You're the first one who's fighting back properly, using the system instead of just enduring the abuse. That evening, Rebecca uploaded all her documentation to the Inspector General's secure filing system. Her formal complaint was 47 pages long, supported by witness statements, technical data, and a comprehensive timeline of Keynes' retaliatory actions. The automated response indicated that her complaint had been received and assigned case number IG2024 Sevion 0847. A full investigation would be launched within 72 hours, with preliminary findings expected within 30 days. Kane had 48 hours left to savor his victory over the pilot he thought he'd destroyed. After that, he would discover that some battles are won not through superior firepower, but through superior preparation and the courage to use every available weapon in your arsenal. The war was just beginning, and Rebecca had spent her entire career learning how to win wars. The Inspector General's team arrived at Redstone on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before Rebecca's scheduled transfer to the Transportation Division. They came quietly, without fanfare, but word spread through the facility within hours that outside investigators were conducting interviews and reviewing training records. Colonel Kane's confident demeanor began showing cracks by midday. Rebecca watched from across the mess hall as he fielded multiple phone calls, his voice rising with each conversation. By afternoon, he'd canceled all scheduled training exercises and locked himself in his office with the base legal officer. Rebecca's transfer orders had been mysteriously delayed pending administrative review, military bureaucracy's way of freezing all personnel actions until the investigation was complete. She used the unexpected time to continue her normal training activities, maintaining the professional composure that had carried her through 3 combat deployments. The lead investigator, Major Lisa Thompson, was a no-nonsense officer with 20 years of experience in military legal affairs. She interviewed Rebecca for 3 hours, going through every incident with methodical precision. "Your documentation is exceptionally thorough," Thompson noted, reviewing the timeline Rebecca had prepared. "Most complaints we receive are based on general grievances or personal conflicts. This reads like an operational brief." "I learned early in my career that details matter," Rebecca replied, "especially when lives are on the line." Thompson's expression suggested she understood the implication. This wasn't about hurt feelings or personality conflicts. It was about systematic abuse of command authority that could compromise military readiness and effectiveness. Over the next 2 days, the investigators interviewed every pilot in the program, all the simulation technicians, and several administrative staff members. Jake provided a detailed witness statement about the systematic exclusion he'd observed. The other pilots shared their own experiences with Kane's retaliatory behavior. Most damaging to Kane's position was the technical evidence. Sergeant Bradley's simulation data proved conclusively that Kane had failed Maneuver 6B multiple times, while Rebecca had executed it flawlessly. The contrast between his public ridicule of her abilities and his own documented failures created a clear pattern of projection and retaliation. On Thursday afternoon, Major Thompson called Rebecca into a private conference room for a final interview. "Captain Hayes, I want you to understand the seriousness of what you've initiated here." Thompson began. "This investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic misconduct that extends far beyond your personal experience. We're looking at potential violations of multiple military regulations, possible criminal charges related to abuse of authority, and institutional failures that may require significant reforms." Rebecca nodded, maintaining her professional composure, despite the gravity of Thompson's words. "However," Thompson continued, "I also want you to understand that pursuing this complaint to its full conclusion will likely involve months of additional investigation, formal hearings, and intense scrutiny of your own performance and motivations. Some people will view you as a troublemaker, regardless of the investigation's outcome. Are you prepared for that?" "Ma'am," Rebecca replied, "I've been shot at by enemy forces who wanted to kill me, and I've been undermined by people who were supposed to support me. I can handle whatever consequences come from doing the right thing." Thompson smiled for the first time during their interviews. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." On Friday morning, Colonel Kane was called to an emergency meeting with the base commander and the investigating team. He emerged an hour later looking like he'd aged 5 years, his usual arrogant confidence replaced by barely controlled panic. Word spread quickly through unofficial channels that Kane had been relieved of his command responsibilities, pending the investigation's outcome. His access to personnel files had been revoked, his authority over training assignments suspended, and his future at Redstone effectively terminated. The interim commander, Colonel James Patterson, called an all-hands meeting that afternoon. His message was brief but clear, effective immediately. All training assignments will be based solely on performance metrics and program requirements. Any instructor found engaging in discriminatory or retaliatory behavior will face immediate disciplinary action. He looked directly at Rebecca as he continued. "Every pilot in this program earned their place here through demonstrated skill and dedication. That's the only standard that matters, and it's the only standard we'll use moving forward." For the first time in weeks, Rebecca felt like she could breathe freely. The systematic isolation was over. The transfer orders had been permanently canceled, and she was officially restored to full participation in the advanced training program. But the most satisfying moment came when Kane cleared out his office. As he carried his personal belongings to his car, he had to walk past the flight simulator where Rebecca was conducting her afternoon training session, the same simulator where she'd executed the maneuver that had exposed his inadequacies and triggered his campaign of retaliation. She didn't look up from her pre-flight checklist as he passed, but she knew he was watching. Sometimes the most powerful victories are won not through dramatic confrontations, but through the simple act of continuing to excel while your opponents destroy themselves. 3 weeks later, the Inspector General's preliminary findings were released through official military channels. The report was devastating in its clinical precision, documenting systematic violations of military regulations, abuse of command authority, and discriminatory practices that had affected multiple personnel over a 3-year period. Colonel Kane was formally relieved of duty and reassigned to a desk position at a supply depot in Nevada, effectively ending his career in flight training. The report noted that his pattern of retaliatory behavior and professional incompetence made him unsuitable for positions involving personnel management or advanced training responsibilities. More significantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence that Kane's misconduct extended far beyond Rebecca's case. 2 other female pilots had been quietly transferred out of the program in previous years after experiencing similar harassment. Several male pilots had been systematically excluded from training opportunities after challenging Kane's decisions or outperforming his expectations. Rebecca was officially commended for her exceptional courage in reporting misconduct and her unwavering commitment to military standards of professional excellence. The commendation was signed by the Inspector General himself and included language about her distinguished service in combat zones and exemplary performance in advanced training environments. But the moment that felt like true vindication came during a formal ceremony where she was awarded the Advanced Flight Integration Completion Certificate, the same program Kane had tried to force her out of. As she stood at attention while the base commander pinned the wings to her uniform, she could see the other pilots watching with genuine respect and admiration. Jake approached her after the ceremony, grinning broadly. "So what's next for the pilot who brought down Colonel Kane?" "Transfer orders came through yesterday," Rebecca replied, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. "Squadron leader. Position, overseas deployment, combat operations." "Squadron leader?" Jake's eyes widened. "Rebecca, that's incredible. You're not just surviving Kane's sabotage. You're advancing beyond where you would have been if he'd never interfered." It was true. The investigation had attracted attention from senior command officers who had reviewed her complete service record, including her performance at Redstone. Her flawless execution of Maneuver 6B, combined with her professional handling of Kane's harassment, had marked her as exactly the kind of leader military aviation needed. 2 days before her departure, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor. Sergeant Bradley knocked on her quarters door, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might want this," he said, handing her the package. Inside was a printed photograph of her in the flight simulator cockpit, taken during her execution of Maneuver 6B. The image captured the moment of perfect concentration, her hands steady on the controls, displays showing the successful completion of the exercise that had humbled more experienced pilots. "I took this during your simulation," Bradley explained. "Thought someday you might want to remember the moment when everything changed." Rebecca studied the photograph, remembering the silence that had followed her perfect execution, the shock on Kane's face, the grudging respect from pilots who had initially dismissed her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but I don't think I'll need a photograph to remember this." On her final day at Redstone, Rebecca walked through the facility one last time, the flight bay where Kane had made his cruel jokes. The briefing room where she'd been systematically excluded. The simulator where she'd proven her capabilities. Beyond any doubt. As she passed the current training session, she noticed something that made her smile. A young woman, probably mid-20s, with the same determined expression Rebecca remembered from her own arrival, was conducting pre-flight procedures under the watchful eyes of respectful instructors. The cycle was continuing, but the environment had changed. Kane's removal had sent a clear message throughout military aviation. Excellence would be recognized and rewarded, while prejudice and abuse of authority would be swiftly punished. Rebecca's departure from Redstone was quiet and professional, no fanfare, no speeches, just the satisfied knowledge that she'd left the place better than she'd found it. Her new assignment offered challenges and opportunities that Kane's sabotage could never have provided. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won through dramatic battles, but through the patient, professional demonstration that competence and character will ultimately triumph over prejudice and petty tyranny. 6 months later, Rebecca was leading a squadron of 12 pilots in active combat operations, her call sign Phoenix, reflecting both her rise from Kane's attempted destruction and her reputation for bringing damaged aircraft safely home. The promotion had come faster than anyone expected, but her performance had been exemplary in every measurable category. Word of her success had spread through military aviation networks, becoming the kind of story that gets shared in pilot lounges and training facilities across all service branches. Not just the technical details of her perfect simulation execution, but the complete arc of professional resilience, systematic documentation, and ultimate vindication. On a quiet Tuesday evening, Rebecca received a message through the military communication system. The sender was Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a pilot currently enrolled in the Advanced Flight Integration Program at Redstone. Captain Hayes, the message began. You don't know me, but I wanted to thank you for what you did at Redstone. I'm the only woman in my training cohort, and when I arrived, several instructors mentioned your story as an example of what happens when pilots focus on performance rather than politics. The environment here is completely different now, professional, respectful, based entirely on demonstrated capabilities. Today, I successfully completed Maneuver 6B on my first attempt. When I finished, the instructor said, "That's Phoenix level." Execution. I had to ask what that meant, and he told me about your perfect performance under pressure and how you handled the aftermath with such professionalism. I wanted you to know that your example is inspiring the next generation of pilots to maintain the highest standards, no matter what obstacles they face. Rebecca read the message twice, feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal recognition. The changes at Redstone were lasting, institutional, and beneficial to every pilot who would train there in the future. 2 weeks later, she received an official invitation to speak at the annual Military Aviation Leadership Conference, a gathering of senior officers, training commanders, and policymakers from all service branches. The topic requested: professional excellence under adverse conditions, lessons from advanced flight training. Standing at the podium in front of 300 military aviation leaders, Rebecca kept her remarks focused and practical. Excellence in military aviation requires more than technical skill, she began. It requires the courage to maintain professional standards, even when facing institutional resistance, the wisdom to use proper channels for addressing misconduct, and the persistence to document everything with precision that satisfies legal scrutiny. When I executed Maneuver 6B at Redstone, I wasn't trying to prove a point or embarrass anyone. I was simply doing my job to the best of my abilities. But when my competence was met with retaliation rather than recognition, I had a choice: accept the injustice or use the system properly to address it. The military has comprehensive regulations protecting personnel from discrimination and retaliation. Those regulations work, but only when people are brave enough to use them and thorough enough to build cases that can withstand scrutiny. She paused, scanning the audience of officers who would return to their commands with the authority to shape military culture. Every pilot in our service deserves to be evaluated based on their performance, not their demographics. Every training program should operate according to documented standards, not personal prejudices. And every command structure should reward excellence while swiftly addressing misconduct. The enemy doesn't care about our internal politics. They only care about our capabilities. Our job is to ensure that every pilot reaches their maximum potential, regardless of what obstacles they face from people who should be supporting their success. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying, but the real measure of success came in the weeks afterward. Multiple training commands implemented new oversight procedures for performance evaluation. Several officers reached out for guidance on addressing similar situations at their facilities. The Inspector General's office reported a significant increase in properly documented misconduct complaints, suggesting that Rebecca's example had encouraged others to address problems rather than simply endure them. Colonel Kane's story had a different ending. His reassignment to the supply depot had lasted exactly 4 months before he was offered early retirement with reduced benefits. The military aviation community is small, and word travels quickly about officers who abuse their authority. No one wanted to work with someone whose professional judgment had been so thoroughly discredited. On the first anniversary of her Redstone experience, Rebecca received a package with no return address. Inside was a group photograph of the current Advanced Flight Integration Cohort 12 pilots of different backgrounds, genders, and experience levels, all wearing their flight suits with obvious pride and confidence. A handwritten note was attached. Captain Hayes, this is what Redstone looks like now. Professional, merit-based, focused on excellence. Thank you for showing us that fighting back isn't about revenge. It's about making sure the next person doesn't have to fight the same battles. Your legacy here isn't just one perfect simulation run. It's a training program that actually trains the best pilots, regardless of who they are or where they come from. The class of 2025, Rebecca smiled, as she pinned a photograph to her office wall, next to her squadron commendations and combat deployment certificates. But the item she treasured most was a simple email printout, the final Inspector General's report that had officially closed her case with a finding of substantiated misconduct. Systemic reforms implemented. Complainant fully vindicated. 3 years later, Rebecca would be promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and assigned as the new commander of Advanced Flight Integration at Redstone. Her first act would be to establish the Excellence Standards Protocol, a comprehensive system ensuring that every pilot receives equal training opportunities and fair evaluation based solely on documented performance metrics. Her second act would be to personally conduct the orientation briefing for each new training cohort, sharing a simple message. You earned your place here through skill and dedication. That's the only standard that matters, and it's the only standard we'll use. Focus on flying, focus on excellence, and let your performance speak for itself. Kang's nameplate had long since been removed from the command building, replaced by a simple placard reading, Advanced Flight Integration, where excellence takes flight. But his legacy remained in the form of stronger regulations, better oversight procedures, and an institutional memory that would protect future generations of pilots from similar abuse. Rebecca's story became part of military aviation lore, not as a tale of personal triumph, but as a blueprint for how the system could work when people were brave enough to use it properly. The pilot who had been mocked for treating the cockpit like a selfie booth had become the officer who proved that competence, properly documented and professionally defended, could overcome any form of institutional prejudice. Sometimes, the Most important battles aren't fought in combat zones against foreign enemies. Sometimes they're fought in briefing rooms and training facilities against the prejudices and failures of leadership that can destroy good people and weaken military readiness. Rebecca had won her battle not through superior firepower, but through superior preparation, unshakable professionalism, and the understanding that true strength comes from using the system to protect not just yourself, but everyone who will follow in your footsteps. The Cockpit had never been about selfies. It had always been about excellence. And excellence, properly demonstrated and professionally defended, never goes out of style. This story is inspired by the countless service members who have faced discrimination and retaliation while serving their country with distinction. Their courage in fighting for professional standards and equal treatment has strengthened military institutions and opened doors for future generations. Excellence truly knows no boundaries. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated only to prove everyone wrong? Share your own stories in the comments. Your experiences might inspire our next story. For more incredible tales of courage, justice, and triumph over adversity, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. New stories are posted every week, and trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next.